So I've been thinking a lot lately about reading music, and I've decided that I think there are four distinct skills that you need if you want to get really good at it. You can think of them kind of like stages. So you start in stage one and then progress to stage two and learn that skill, and so on. So stage one is the figuring it out stage. We talked about this a couple of videos ago. This is where you learn how the clefs work, you learn some basic tricks like every good boy deserves fudge, and then you use what you know to just figure out what each note is. So if I see this note, for example, I think I'm in a treble clef, every good boy deserves fudge, this is a G, and I figure it out that way. Now this stage is pretty miserable. A lot of people will quit during this stage because reading music feels like doing a math problem every time you find a note. So you want to move out of this as quick as you can, but this is where you start. Now the second stage is the memorization stage. Now in this stage, you have been able to associate a symbol and its position directly with the meaning. So I can look at this and I just think, that's a G. I don't have to relate it to anything. I don't have to count around. I just know it. Now, if you can get to this stage, this might be good enough. You don't necessarily need to learn the next two. And I don't mean that in a like, oh, if you're okay with being mediocre, then feel free to stop. Like for some people, you don't need to be extremely good at reading music. Say you compose EDM music where you're not really writing much down or having to read much, or maybe you're a guitar player in like an 80s cover band or something, just somewhere where reading and writing sheet music isn't a huge part of what you do. You may be better off just getting to this point and then investing your time in some other skill that might be more relevant to what you do. But if you're somebody who needs to read a lot, you're having to memorize, complicated pieces of sheet music and do a lot of performance, anything along those lines, and this depends on your style and instrument and all that stuff, but if that's you, this is probably not good enough, and you need to progress to the next two stages. So the problem with this, even though it's relatively painless for me to look at a note, know what it is, and then, go find it on my instrument, there's still a lot going on there. I'm still having to look at each note individually. I have to think about its letter and then find that on my instrument. And there's just a bit of mental overhead. You can kind of think of this like as if you were reading English and you were sounding out each letter. Like that's okay for a while, but eventually, if you want to be really fluent, that's just not good enough. So the third stage in reading music is what I'm going to call relative reading. So the idea with relative reading, and I'm not sure if this is a widely used term or not, but it's what I'm going to use. The idea with relative reading is that rather than looking at every note as a G or an A or a B, you're more looking at them in a relative sense, where you're looking at the movement of the music, and you're not necessarily interpreting every single note as a letter. So we can kind of rename this to absolute reading. Absolute in the sense that you see a symbol and you know what it is, and then relative in the sense that you're not thinking about the letter, you're just thinking about the way the music is moving. So today we'll focus on relative reading. The fourth and final stage of music reading is something I call pattern recognition. And in some ways, this is kind of a logical extension of relative reading, although there's a lot more to it. So we'll leave that for next lesson. And for now, just focus on the idea of relative reading. So let's just look at what this looks like. We'll take a very simple example. So if I want to read this chunk of music using the memorization method, I'm just going to look at the first note and think, okay, that's a G. I'll find a G over here. I think that's an A. I'll play an A, a B, a D, and so on. If I want to use the relative reading method, I'm actually going to start the same way. I have nothing to relate this first note to, so I actually have to use the memorization method to find this first note. So I'll think, okay, that's a G. But from there, I'll just think this note is one note up in my scale. So I'll move to that one, and this is a note up. And then from here to here, I'll hopefully be able to recognize this as a third. If I see a note moving from a line to a line with one space in between, I know that interval is a third, so I can just do that. If you've procrastinated on getting good with your intervals, now's a good time because it's going to start to hurt you, like as you're reading. and there's tons of other reasons to get good at your intervals. But I'm going to start to learn to recognize certain note shapes. Like if like that line to line, I see that as a third, or a space to a space. I can also recognize a line to a space that looks like that, where I have one space and one line in between, and I'll recognize that as a fourth. It's almost like when you're using this method, you're more focusing on the space between notes than you are on the notes themselves. You actually don't really care what this is in the absolute sense. You're just looking to see how far you want to move to the next one. So I play that. Here again, I just move down by one note, move to here. And then for this part, I could maybe use my relative reading to figure out this bottom note, but probably I don't want to. It gets tough if you have, very long intervals, although, well, it just gets a little tough. So I probably will use my memorization for this bottom note, but once I have that, I can just think this is a third and this is a third. So I find that C, go up a third, and then I have my chord. Now this might look fairly simple, and you might think, oh, I kind of do that already, not that big of a deal. But this is a very simple, very contrived example. If you aren't doing this exactly right, and you don't have exactly the right mental model, this may not progress very well, and you might not really get to where you want to be. So let's talk about what needs to happen mentally, or what your mental model should be when you're trying to switch into this relative mode. Now, the naive way of doing this is to start with this first note. Like I said, you have to use the memorization method, so you get a G. And then what often happens is you'll think, okay, this is a G, and the next note up is an A. Like I don't have to use my figuring it out method. I can just, go up one letter in the musical alphabet and I get to an A. And then this is a B. And then I skip two notes and go to a D. That is not actually what you want. Now, if you're stuck in the figuring it out method, this will happen very quickly and very naturally, even before you've learned any of the memorization stuff. And this will feel really nice. Like, oh, I can just figure out the next note and the next one without having to go through all those little tricks and counting through the staff. That's better than the figuring it out method because you don't have to count around, but it's not any better than the memorization method because you're still looking at each note as a letter. You're still thinking G, A, B, and D. So this is a complete lateral move from the memorization method. What you want is to start thinking about directions. You want to think, I'm moving up in the key, or I'm moving, up by a third or down by a third, or whatever else. You're trying to get rid of the letter names from that mental process. So on the keyboard, rather than trying to think of notes as a sequence of G, A, B, C, try to think of them as a picture. So imagine that we're playing something in the key of A major. Rather than me thinking A, B, C sharp, D, and all that, I try to, it's a little hard to draw this with the dry erase marker, but try to picture some kind of shape, something like this. This is what I want in my head when I think of the key of A. And when I need to play a sequence of notes, I don't want to think play an A, play a B, play a D, play a C sharp. I want to be thinking, like I said, the first note, I'll think play A, because I need to know that from the absolute sense. But then I'll just think move up by a third, move down. And I'm just moving to different points in that shape. Now you need to know a lot more to use the relative method versus the memorization method. With the memorization, or the absolute reading, you just see a note, you figure out what it is, and then you find it. But to use the relative method, you need to understand what key you're in, you need to understand when the key is shifting, you need to understand when something weird happens, like a secondary dominant, or any kind of change in the music, and you need to be able to see that on your instrument in this very clear, instinctual kind of way. This is a big reason why you learn different keys and scales on the piano or on the guitar. You need to be able to visualize it and play, inside and out those different keys. So the big question is, how do you practice this? How do you actually get better with your relative reading skill? This can actually be a lot more difficult than you might think, but I have one method in particular that I think works really well. So I'll show you how to do that. So to start with, just grab some very simple music. Like first time piano player level stuff. This is a site called 8 Notes. If you're watching this video a couple years in the future, I'm sure it's long gone or turned into something horrible, but I'll put some links to a couple others. You can find a book from your local music store, just something really easy. And this site is kind of a mix of paid and free stuff, but they do have a decent little selection of like beginner piano pieces. So grab something really simple, like I'm a Little Teapot level. Now to start with, you can just go ahead and play through it. Just try to focus on what we talked about, like looking for the relative movement of notes, thinking in terms of the go up, move up by a third, that kind of thing. I'd even recommend just splitting up the hand, so just do the right hand. So you just play it. I don't think you want to hear me play all that. But, and then here's the important part. Take the song, play it again, but play it in a different key. So we can just use that key of A major. So you're looking at the music, but you're going to play it in a totally different key. So I'll play it here. And you go through it like that. Now here's the reason for that, and here's why I think that is the best method to use to learn this. Your brain, whenever possible, is going to fall back to the simplest method it can find to solve a problem. So if you're really good at your memorization reading or the absolute reading, then you see a note and your brain just kind of knows what it is right away without you really even trying to think about it. So that note just gets in your head and then you play it and you're not really able to force yourself to lean on the relative reading. Even though this is going to be easier in the long term, in the moment, it's not. It's harder, so your brain's just going to pick the easier path. And you kind of wind up with this problem. You can't really get over that hump. But that's not the only problem. There's all kinds of things that your brain will rely on. So you'll notice with most of these simple pieces, like I'm a Little Teapot or Hot Cross Buns or whatever, they're almost always in C or they're always in G. And they're almost always in the same position, like that middle C position there. So you can sit there and work on this and practice, and you'll think that you're getting better and better at your relative reading, but actually you're just associating a note with a finger position, which is really easy, but as soon as you move somewhere else, that skill that you just developed is totally wasted. Or anything else, like if you play a song once and then play it again, it's already half memorized, everything's very familiar, and you're not really even interpreting notes anymore. You're just kind of remembering where they were. So this is the only way I've been able to come up with that forces you not to do that. You can take a song, put it in a different key, and that forces you to not be able to use the memorization method because the notes no longer match up to what you're playing, and you're having to think about the shape of the key and how to move from one to the next. Now the memorization thing is still a problem. If you play this over and over, even if you're shifting keys, you're just going to start to get familiar with how the notes move and what that looks like when you play it. So for this type of practice, it's similar to sight reading practice, if you've ever done that before, like in a class or something, where you want to take a piece of music and use it a couple times and then just discard it because you've already started to memorize it and it's not really that useful anymore. But that is what I recommend for getting better at this. Now, in terms of progression, how you like push this further and further, obviously you can do different keys, try harder keys, things that you find more difficult, key of F sharp major or something weird. But like I said, don't use one song for too long. Take a piece of music, use it in a couple keys, and then move on to the next. Be careful of speed. You really don't want to progress the speed too much. Like being able to do this really, really fast is not that relevant. You're much better off trying to find something that has a lot more jumps. Like try to get used to seeing the interval of a fifth and knowing how to do that, or whatever level of interval you find difficult. In general, the bigger the interval, the harder it is to recognize and then execute in the key. music with more going on, so like multiple voice lines, that becomes a whole lot harder. And that's what you want to look for in terms of progression. Don't just sit there and play like this really simple stuff and just try to go faster and faster. Just try to explore the other corners of the things that you have trouble visualizing being able to put on your instrument. But that's how you want to progress with this. So that's it for now. There'll be a lot more to talk about with the pattern recognition stuff. Remember, I have a Patreon if you want to help support and help me get these videos out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.